Part 1 ended on 3 facts that changed the galaxy. The Dark Council, 12 Sith Lords who had governed an empire for centuries, was crushed. Vitiate, the Sith Emperor who had consolidated his power across nearly 1,400 years and made an entire planet a force void just to announce his arrival, was absorbed. The Eternal Fleet, 300 autonomous warships built on Iokath and operated by a hive mind of GEMINI droids, now answered to a new master. And that new master felt exactly what one of you described him feeling. Palpatine had an absolute blast of euphoria through the entire ordeal. You were right, he did. But euphoria is a funny thing in the dark side. It isn't joy. It's closer to hunger satisfied. And a Sith who has just satisfied the largest hunger of his life doesn't get to rest. He gets a bigger hunger. And Sidious, standing in the ruins of a conquered empire, scanning every corner of the Force for the next obstacle, found nothing that threatened him. Almost nothing. Somewhere at the edge of perception. Not a presence exactly, more like a gap in what should be there, was a signature he didn't recognize. The Force couldn't fully resolve it. It was light and dark simultaneously, blurred together in a way that shouldn't exist by any Sith doctrine he'd ever studied. His training told him that was impossible. His instincts told him to be careful. His arrogance told him it didn't matter. That arrogance is what this story is about, and the name that comes with it. Revan. To understand what Revan means to this galaxy, what he meant to the Old Republic, to the Sith, to the Force itself, you need to go back approximately 3,960 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Mandalorian Wars. A conflict the Jedi Council had explicitly decided not to enter, because their seers kept getting bad feelings about it. The Republic was being ground down. Then a prodigal Jedi Knight looked at his elder's hesitation and decided he disagreed. He led the Republic to victory, defeated Mandalore the Ultimate, broke the Mandalorian people's central identity, the idea of themselves as an undefeated warrior culture, in a single campaign. And then he kept going. He traveled beyond the Outer Rim, further than almost any Jedi had gone, looking for whatever had been pulling at him. What he found was Vitiate, the Sith Emperor. And Vitiate did to Revan exactly what he did to everyone he deemed worth keeping. He broke his mind and rebuilt it as a weapon aimed back at the Republic. Revan returned as Darth Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, with a new apprentice named Malak, and a plan to subjugate everything he'd just defended. The Jedi Council eventually captured him, stripped his memories, all of them, decades of identity gone, and handed him back a blank slate. He pieced himself together, found out who he'd been, and instead of falling again, he used what he knew to defeat his former apprentice. That right there is the thing about Revan that no power level metric can capture. He defeated Darth Malak without his memories, without his history, with nothing but the raw architecture of a mind that had already survived being destroyed once. It didn't end there. Revan eventually went back for Vitiate, the source of everything that had gone wrong. He brought a Jedi called Mitra Surik and a Sith named Lord Scourge, and the three of them nearly made it work. Nearly. Mitra was killed by Scourge before the fight could conclude. Revan was incapacitated by the Emperor's force lightning and imprisoned, held in a state between life and death for 300 years, with Vitiate feeding on him the whole time. The Emperor kept Revan alive because Revan's mind was the only one he'd encountered he couldn't simply break. For 3 centuries, Vitiate tried. Revan didn't give him what he wanted. That is what resisting the Sith Emperor's mental domination for centuries looks like. Not a combat feat, but a feat of pure will. 300 years of sustained resistance against the most powerful Sith who had ever lived. When Revan finally emerged, when his Force signature split, the light side reaching toward the Force itself, while the dark side anchored him back, he became something the galaxy had no proper category for. He wasn't a Jedi. He wasn't a Sith. He channeled what sources from his era described as pure Force power, simultaneously drawing on both traditions without the corruption that either path traditionally demanded. His lightsaber approach, Form 6 Niman's diplomatic adaptability, layered with Form 7 Juyo's intensity and Form 4 Ataru's acrobatic aggression, mirrored that nature. No single school, everything at once. He aided in Vitiate's final destruction in what Subbultor's Echoes of Oblivion expansion confirms was the Emperor's ultimate end. Then he was gone. Until now. In the weeks after his conquest of the Old Republic's remnants, Palpatine settled into something a Sith Emperor doesn't often get to feel, a sense of completion. The dark side, in those first days, felt like standing at the top of a mountain nobody else had climbed. He had absorbed Vitiate, nearly 1,400 years of accumulated Force energy, the life-draining harvest of an entire planet, the essence of the Sith's most ancient power, and it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had clarified things. He wasn't just the most powerful Sith alive. He was, by any measurement, the most powerful Sith who had ever existed. He walked the corridors of what had been the Sith Emperor's citadel and felt the dark side ripple with recognition. This was his now, all of it. But something was wrong. He'd felt it within hours of the absorption, a kind of turbulence beneath his own thoughts, like a second current running under a still river. Vitiate wasn't simply fuel. Vitiate had been a consciousness for nearly 1,400 years, and consciousness at that scale of power doesn't dissolve. It persists. It looks for purchase. Somewhere in the architecture of Palpatine's own Force presence, nearly 1,400 years of Vitiate's accumulated will was doing what Vitiate had always done, looking for a way out, and a way to dominate whatever it found. Palpatine dismissed it. He was the master of his own Force presence. He had spent decades constructing the most carefully maintained dark side consciousness in the history of the Sith. The idea that anything he had absorbed could threaten his dominance was, he found the word distasteful, unthinkable. He filed it. He moved on. He began planning the next phase of consolidation. He wouldn't think about that second current again until it was too late to prepare for it. Revan felt the absorption happen from across the Force. He'd been anchored to the galaxy in his post-death state. Not alive, not entirely gone, but present at the margins of the Force, in the way that only a consciousness which has been forcibly split and then re-merged learns to be. He knew Vitiate's signature the way you know a scar, from the inside. 300 years of imprisonment had made him intimately familiar with every pattern of the Emperor's Force presence. So when that presence suddenly contracted, when nearly 1,400 years of accumulated consciousness was consumed by something else, something that burned with the cold, structured power of Sidious's dark side, Revan didn't need to investigate. He knew exactly what had happened. More importantly, he knew what it meant. Whatever had just absorbed Vitiate hadn't absorbed a stable quantity. Vitiate's essence transfer capability, his documented ability to persist inside other beings and work from within them, the same ability the Outlander had experienced firsthand for years, was his most dangerous trait. Revan had watched it operate for 3 centuries. Whoever had taken Vitiate into themselves had not won. They had inherited a war. Revan could feel it. And he knew something else. This new conqueror had not encountered him, had not expected him, wasn't, yet, afraid. That was the window. He reached into the Force with the full breadth of what he was, light and dark braided together in a signature that no being raised entirely in one tradition could fully read, and he started to find who else was still in the galaxy. Who else had fought this kind of power before and survived? He started making a list. The first name was the easiest, the one that felt like blood. Satele Shan was the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. More than that, she was the descendant of Bastila Shan and Revan, their lineage running forward through generations to land, finally, in someone who carried both their names and something of both their capabilities. Revan's heir in everything but direct succession. When he reached for her through the Force, the connection was immediate. Not because she was expecting it, because the bloodline recognized something it had always been waiting for. She'd already felt the conquest. Every Jedi sensitive to the Force had felt it. The sudden weight in the dark side, the sense that something enormous had shifted. Satele had spent the weeks since then cataloging what she knew, assembling what she could. She was a grand master, not a politician. The distinction mattered. She thought in terms of what could be done, not what should diplomatically be attempted. She had fought Malgus personally at the sacking of Coruscant in 3653 BBY. She knew what it meant to stand against things that shouldn't be survivable. When Revan explained what had been absorbed and what that meant, she asked one question. "What do you need?" He told her. The second name was harder. Not because Malgus was difficult to find. A force presence like his didn't hide, it broadcast. But because asking Darth Malgus to fight alongside Jedi required a justification that went beyond military necessity. Malgus was a Sith Lord who had killed Jedi Master Ven Zallo at Coruscant in combat so decisive that eyewitnesses had difficulty reconstructing what they'd seen. He had declared his own new empire during the Battle of Ilum around 3641 BBY, one free of the Dark Council's infighting, built on alien alliances and cross-species collaboration. He had been resurrected as a cyborg after that defeat. He had spent years since collecting Vitiate's artifacts, studying what the Emperor had built, trying to understand how one Sith had accumulated that much power. Malgus's entire long game had been pointing at one destination, to become the next Vitiate. And now, someone outside the Sith tradition entirely had taken that power, had absorbed it without earning it, without understanding it, without being part of the culture that had produced it. A conqueror from a different era who hadn't fought for this galaxy, who had simply arrived and taken. Vitiate's power was Sith power. It belonged, in whatever framework Malgus operated inside, to someone who had come up through that tradition and proved themselves worthy of it through conflict. An outsider had taken it. Revan didn't appeal to Malgus's conscience, because Malgus didn't have one in any conventional sense. He appealed to his ideology. The man who had wanted to be Vitiate would never follow the man who had become him. But he might fight alongside whoever was going to tear that man down. Malgus agreed. His terms were characteristically direct. No one gives orders, everyone fights, and when this is over, the question of what comes next gets answered with strength, not sentiment. Revan accepted all three conditions. The next three were a family, which made them the most complicated. Archon was the son of Valkorion, Vitiate in his Zakulan incarnation. The same consciousness that Sidious had now absorbed had been Archon's father, in the sense that Vitiate had been a father, possessively, manipulatively, with the specific cruelty of someone who understood his children's weaknesses because he'd engineered them. Archon had ruled the Eternal Empire after Valkorion's apparent dormancy, had led the Eternal Fleet against the Republic and the Sith Empire simultaneously, had burned down a significant portion of the galaxy before something in him finally broke in the other direction. His redemption arc was complicated. Redemption arcs always are when the person being redeemed has that kind of ledger. But it was real. What Archon had that nobody else in the Coalition possessed was a command relationship with the Eternal Fleet. 300 autonomous warships, built on Iokath, operated by GEMINI droids, sentient, linked in a hive mind, designed to respond to the chain of command that Archon represented. Sidious had seized control of that fleet during Part 1's conquest, and in his confidence had assumed the control was complete. What he hadn't accounted for was that command architecture doesn't simply transfer. The GEMINI droids were built with specific hierarchical parameters. Archon wasn't just a user of the fleet. He was built into its recognition system at a level Sidious's override couldn't fully reach. If Archon showed up at the edge of that fleet's engagement range and spoke with the authority his name carried in the GEMINI hierarchy, those ships would experience something their new commander wasn't prepared for. A split in their loyalties, half responding to Sidious's commands, half flickering back toward a voice they were programmed to recognize. That was worth more than any strike team. That was a lever inside Sidious's most significant military asset. Revan found Archon in the wreckage of what had been the Eternal Empire's outer holdings. The man who answered wasn't the Emperor who had terrorized 2 galaxies worth of civilizations. He was someone who had spent considerable time understanding exactly what his father had made him into, and had not made peace with it, but had decided to keep going anyway. He agreed to come. No conditions. He just asked whether Valen was part of this. Revan said yes. Archon nodded once and didn't say anything else. Valen was the hardest conversation of all, and not because she was hard to persuade. She was hard to find. Valen had died at the conclusion of the Knights of the Eternal Throne. Her conditioning phrase, "Kneel before the Dragon of Zakul," had been used against her in her final battle, unraveling the psychological architecture built around her since childhood. Valkorion had authorized that conditioning himself. His own daughter, restrained not with shackles but with language, because even he feared what she was capable of. Before she was born, Valen had displayed force ability powerful enough to move furniture from inside the womb. As a toddler, she had been extraordinary. As an adult, she was the most untethered force presence in the known galaxy. Pure power with minimal architecture around it, because the architecture that should have been there had been deliberately destroyed to make her controllable. She was also dead. But the Force doesn't process someone like Valen out of existence cleanly. Death through the exploitation of a deliberately created psychological wound leaves traces. Revan, who had spent centuries learning every corner of what exists between life and the Force, found her the way you find something in a dark room. Not by looking directly, but by noticing what everything else is moving around. He brought her back not through resurrection, not through Sith tricks or Jedi tradition, but through the same principle that had kept him present at the margins of the galaxy. The Force holds on to those it isn't finished with. Valen, unfinished in every sense, had not fully let go. What Revan offered wasn't life restored to what it had been. It was agency. For the first time, no conditioning phrase, no father's engineering, no throne to occupy or fleet to command. Just the question, do you want to fight? She did. The 5th member of the coalition required the most explanation, because Thexan was dead in a way that left less margin than Valen's. Killed by Archon during the opening stages of the Knights of the Fallen Empire, his twin brother's hand, an act that had broken something in Archon that never healed cleanly, even after redemption. Thexan was gone. Except that Vitiate had a specific relationship to those around him, particularly those of his blood. His essence transfer capabilities, the same ability that had allowed him to persist inside the Outlander for years, the same ability that made his absorption by Sidious so potentially dangerous, extended to something more subtle, the habit of claiming. Vitiate didn't simply let the people he'd shaped slip away into the Force. He preserved what he found useful. And Thexan, killed before Valkorion had finished using him as an instrument to shape Archon, existed in a state of partial preservation inside the Force nexus that Vitiate's power had created. Not alive, not entirely gone, held at the threshold by the same consciousness that had consumed the life force of an entire planet to buy itself nearly 1,400 years of existence. When Sidious absorbed Vitiate, he absorbed everything Vitiate was holding, including this. Revan reached into that nexus, familiar territory given his own history inside it, and found Thexan. Not all of him. Enough to be present, to act, to make one last choice. When Revan explained what was happening, when Thexan understood that his brother was involved, and that the consciousness that had claimed him might be broken apart from the inside, he chose. He came. When Archon saw him, he didn't speak for a long time. Thexan, in whatever state he now existed, simply stood beside his brother the way twins do, close enough that the space between them felt wrong when anyone else tried to occupy it. Revan watched this and felt the weight of what he'd assembled. Jedi, Sith, a redeemed Emperor, a dead woman burning with unspent power, a ghost still loyal to his brother across whatever distance death puts between people. He'd fought with less. Sidious was meditating when the Force told him something was coming. He recognized the warning not because he felt the coalition directly, he couldn't, not yet, but because the second current inside him, the one he'd been dismissing for weeks, suddenly surged. Vitiate's essence, which had been pressing against the boundaries of his force presence in a low-level, persistent way he'd categorized as manageable, was doing something he hadn't anticipated. It was responding to something outside. Like a compass needle snapping to magnetic north, the imprisoned consciousness within him oriented itself, and Sidious, following that orientation, felt the direction it was pointing, toward an absence in the Force. A signature that his dark side perception couldn't fully resolve. Light and dark simultaneously, blended in proportions that shouldn't produce a stable reading, and yet absolutely stable. His Force sight, which could pick out individual presences across a planetary system, kept sliding off this signature the way water slides off treated glass. He'd sensed this before. That blurred edge at the horizon of his perception. He'd filed it as anomalous. He'd been wrong to file it. His euphoria had been enormous, and it had been real. But euphoria, even in the dark side, is a specific cognitive state, and one of its defining characteristics is that it narrows attention. You focus on what you've achieved. You stop scanning for what you haven't. Sidious had conquered the Dark Council, absorbed a nearly 1,400-year-old emperor, seized 300 warships. He had experienced the largest single augmentation of power in the history of the Sith Order. And in that experience, he had briefly, catastrophically, stopped looking. Revan had been moving in that gap. Sidious rose from his meditation. He reached into the Force and tried to read what was approaching. The dark side showed him fragments. Combat, deliberate and coordinated. A fleet response, partial and contested. Something that felt like the Force itself, bearing down on a single point. He got none of the clarity he was accustomed to. The blurred signature at the center of the incoming Force kept scattering his perception. This was, in a very specific sense, new. In 50 years of operating as Darth Sidious, he had never encountered a Force user whose presence he couldn't read. The dark side at his level of mastery functioned as omnidirectional awareness, perception extending beyond what any Jedi's Force sight could reach, reading intentions as easily as words. He had known Mace Windu's combat intent before Windu himself had fully committed to it. He had felt Yoda's approach on Coruscant before Yoda had landed. He had parsed every Force user he'd ever faced through that awareness, like a lock being picked. Revan didn't parse. He scattered. What scatters your perception, what you can't read, you can't counter before it arrives. That was the first cost. Small, but real. The first thing, in 50 years, that Palpatine had encountered and couldn't see clearly. He prepared anyway, because he was Sidious, and preparation was its own form of dominance. They came to him across a hyperspace exit he hadn't been able to predict with precision, because the trajectory of a Force user who doesn't fully register in the dark side is nearly impossible to extrapolate. 3 waves. Arcan's wing first, commanding the portion of the Eternal Fleet that still held his recognition code, while Sidious's portion of the GEMINI hive mind began the catastrophic process of receiving contradictory instructions from 2 legitimate authorities in its hierarchy. The fleet didn't mutiny. It hesitated. And a 300-ship formation experiencing simultaneous hesitation looks, in tactical terms, like a gap wide enough to fly through. Malgus came through that gap first. He came in a ship that had seen better decades, with no escort, because Malgus had never believed in escort. He came because a conqueror from a different era had taken the central obsession of his political life, the power of Vitiate, which Malgus had spent years cataloging and approaching and trying to eventually replicate, and had absorbed it without earning it. That was the specific insult that made this personal. Not the conquest of the Sith Empire, not the destruction of the Dark Council. The theft of what Malgus had considered, in the most private part of his ideology, to be the Sith tradition's highest achievement. Vitiate's power was Sith power. An outsider had taken it. Malgus didn't communicate his intent when his ship exited hyperspace. He simply opened a channel to the space in front of him and said, in a voice that had once caused crew members' ears to bleed and destroyed Republic starfighters with its resonance alone, "Come out." Satil Shan came through an approach vector 90 degrees from Malgus's, with a small formation of Jedi strike ships, because the Grand Master of the Jedi Order's instinct, even in a situation this far outside any documented protocol, was to bring enough people that nobody felt they were dying alone. She'd spent years holding an institution together through wars, through the sacking of Coruscant, through the collapse of the Republic she'd been appointed to protect. She wasn't at peace with any of it, but she was here. Valen appeared at the edge of the engagement zone like a weather system that had decided to move in a specific direction. Her presence in the Force was enormous and immediate. No subtlety, no suppression, just the raw signal of someone who had been denied agency for her entire existence and was finished with that arrangement. Even the Sith Lords in Sidious's outer guard, practitioners who had fought wars and killed hundreds, felt her arrival and instinctively reached for their weapons before they understood why. Thexan came with Arcan, not visible to everyone, not entirely present in any physical sense, but Arcan moved differently with his brother beside him, steadier, with a focus the redeemed Emperor hadn't quite managed on his own. The twin who had died to Arcan's hands had not come back to accuse him. He'd come back to stand with him. That was the thing Arcan couldn't quite believe, even as it was happening, and the thing Valen understood immediately. Because despite everything Valkorion had done to her, she'd recognized Thexan's specific kind of loyalty, even as a child, and had trusted it against every other lesson her life had taught her. Then Revan. He came last, which was intentional. A general who arrives at the front of his forces is a soldier. A general who arrives after his forces are engaged is someone with a plan. His Force signature hit Sidious's awareness like nothing Sidious had ever encountered. That impossible blend, light and dark in a proportion his perception kept trying to resolve and failing. A presence that his most fundamental sense of the Force couldn't locate precisely. He knew someone was there. He couldn't tell you exactly where. He couldn't predict the direction of the next move. Sidious made a decision he would later understand was his first major mistake. He engaged personally. A Palpatine who had not just absorbed nearly 1,400 years of Vitiate's accumulated hunger would have held his ground, let the engagement unfold at range, used the fleet, even in its hesitating, contested state, to wear down the coalition before they could consolidate. Patience was his signature. Patience was, in the language of his own doctrine, the Sith's true weapon. But the turbulence of Vitiate's internal pressure had done something subtle to his judgment. The hunger was stronger than the patience. He wanted this resolved. He wanted to look at the thing scattering his perception and make it stop. He came forward. The fight, when it began, wasn't what either side had designed. Malgus went for the outer guard in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for something to hit for a very long time. His Force scream, a combat application of his voice that resonated in the Force itself, not just in air, hit the guard formation and created a window in which the most immediate threats to the Coalition's advance couldn't coordinate. 20 seconds of disoriented guards is a long time when you know what to do with it. Satil Shan used those seconds to establish a Force anchor, a point of light-side stability in the middle of the engagement that functioned less like an attack and more like a counterweight. The dark side at the concentration Sidious maintained around his position was a physical pressure that pushed against every light-aligned combatant in the zone. The anchor didn't eliminate that pressure, but it gave the Coalition's Jedi-aligned members something to orient against, a fixed point in chaos. Valen simply fought, which was terrifying to watch in the specific way that someone who has never been allowed to use their full power, finally using it's always terrifying. She didn't use techniques. She used the Force. Raw, undisciplined by any school, enormous in its output. She hit the flank of Sidious's position like a storm system that hadn't been tracked because it had never existed before. Arcan worked the GEMINI hive mind's flickering loyalty as his tactical map. He could feel which ships had reverted to his recognition pattern and which still held to Sidious's override. He kept that information flowing in real time, making sure the Eternal Fleet's hesitation remained a liability for Sidious, rather than a resolved problem. Thexan was present in ways that resist military vocabulary. He wasn't fighting. He was preventing certain things from going wrong, a warning that reached Archon's instincts 2 seconds before an attack landed, a pull on Valen's shoulder when she was about to overextend into a trap. A ghost working in the margins of a battle his living siblings were fighting. It was, in practical terms, exactly the role he'd always played for his brother. And Revan found Sidious. The first exchange was brief and almost educational. Sidious opened with Force Lightning, his signature, the technique that had incapacitated Revan in his initial confrontation with Vitiate 3 centuries prior. The logic was sound. It had worked on the most powerful student the most powerful Sith Emperor in history had ever produced. It should work now. Revan redirected it. Not blocked it the way a lightsaber blocks an energy blade. Redirected it. Absorbed the charge through the dark side aspect of his Force presence and released it through the light side aspect in a different direction. A conversion that required simultaneous fluency in both traditions. Sidious's training had no framework for this. The lightning hit a section of bulkhead to his left. Sidious stared at the scorch marks for a fraction of a second. Then he adjusted. His adjustment was the most dangerous thing about him. He recalibrated in real time, pulling his Force presence tight, stopping his attempts to read Revan's signature, accepting the perceptual limitation as a fixed condition of this engagement, and working around it rather than against it. Most Sith, faced with something they couldn't read, would press harder against the thing they couldn't see. Sidious stopped pressing and started repositioning, but the second current moved. Vitiate's essence, which had been pressing against the walls of Sidious's Force presence since the absorption, felt the proximity of Revan's signature and responded the way it had always responded to Revan, with recognition. 300 years of imprisonment had made Revan's Force presence intimately familiar to the consciousness that had held him. That recognition wasn't Sidious's choice. It was Vitiate's. It happened inside Sidious, without his permission, and it cost him something he never surrendered willingly. A split second of focus. Revan felt it. He had lived inside that recognition for 3 centuries. He knew its texture. And he knew something Sidious didn't. When Vitiate's attention fixed on something, the host paid a price. The Outlander had experienced it. Years of Valkorian's consciousness running parallel to theirs, his agenda always operating alongside and sometimes against their own. Sidious had absorbed something that didn't just accumulate power, it accumulated will. And will, at Vitiate's scale, doesn't subordinate itself easily. The internal fracture opened. Sidious felt it the way you feel an earthquake before you hear it, a vibration in the foundation of his own Force presence, the structure he'd spent decades making perfect, suddenly running along a fault line he hadn't known was there. Vitiate's essence wasn't fighting him in any linear sense. It was asserting itself, making itself known at the exact moment Sidious needed his full concentration on an external opponent who couldn't be read and could redirect lightning. His Force presence contracted, just slightly, just enough. Malgus hit him from the left. Not a killing blow. Malgus understood killing blows required proper angles, and proper angles require a stationary target. But the blow landed, which was notable. In 50 years of combat at the highest levels, through his fight with Mace Windu and his battle with Yoda on the Senate floor, Sidious had sustained damage. He had never simply been hit by an opponent who came at him while his attention was genuinely elsewhere. This was categorically new. Satil Shan drove the attack from the opposite side. Not a Sith assault, but a Jedi application of form and force that compressed Sidious's defensive awareness into a narrow band, feeling everything happening, but the required decisions arriving faster than sustained processing could handle. She'd trained for this. Not for this exactly, but for combat against opponents who exceeded her students' individual capability. The Grand Master of a Jedi Order that had survived everything the Sith had thrown at it for 3 millennia had learned that fighting someone stronger meant making them fight everyone at once. Valen's strike came through the middle like a pressure wave with no polite form. She pushed with everything she had, in the specific way that someone who has spent their entire existence being held back pushes when the hold finally releases. Sidious deflected most of it. Most. A fraction got through. The fraction was substantial, and it hit the internal fault line at exactly the wrong moment. Vitiate surged. This was the consequence the euphoria had obscured, the thing Sidious would have known to prepare for if his attention in the weeks after the absorption had focused on the cost rather than the triumph. Vitiate's essence transfer capability, his documented ability to persist inside host bodies and operate from within them, had not been rendered passive by Sidious's will. It had been temporarily contained. And in this moment, with Sidious's focus split across 6 opponents, with the fault line cracking, with Revan's proximity triggering something like muscle memory in a consciousness that had studied Revan for 3 centuries, temporary containment failed. Sidious felt his own force presence begin to fragment at the edges. Not collapse, not surrender, fragment. The unified structure he built over decades, developing seams he had never felt before. Vitiate's nearly 1,400-year-old will pressing through those seams with the patient, inescapable pressure of something that had never been in a hurry because it had never needed to be. He had perhaps 10 seconds before the fracture reached a depth his opponents could exploit. He used those 10 seconds with the single-minded efficiency that had always distinguished him from other Sith, who tended to fight the problem in front of them when the real problem was usually somewhere else. He didn't fight Revan. He didn't fight Malgus or Satil Shan or Valen. He turned the full force of his attention inward, to the fault line itself, and he did the one thing his doctrine told him was always available. He stopped resisting, and he consumed. Not Vitiate wholesale. Vitiate's consciousness at full assertion wasn't something even Sidious, in his current state, could simply devour. But the leading edge of it, the part that had pressed through the seams most aggressively, he captured and converted. The dark side, at his level of mastery, didn't distinguish between energy that came from inside and energy that came from outside. It was all fuel. He'd just found more. The fracture sealed. Not cleanly, not permanently, but enough. He turned back to the coalition with Vitiate's energy temporarily incorporated into his own output, and what he released was larger than anything he'd discharged in this fight. A force emanation that drove every being in the engagement zone back by pure kinetic weight. Not targeted, not elegant, vast. The kind of thing that happens when nearly 1,400 years of accumulation gets pointed at a single problem all at once. Everyone staggered. Malgus went to one knee. Satil Shan held her ground by anchoring to the fixed point she'd established, but the anchor cracked. Valen was pushed back 30 feet before her raw mass of force presence stopped the movement. Archon felt it through the GEMINI connection. Even the droids registered the discharge in their sensor architecture. Revan didn't stagger. He was hit, and he took it, and he remained where he was, with the particular quality of someone who has already been through worse and knows the difference between a blow that ends things and a blow that doesn't. He looked at Sidious across the engagement zone, and in that look, which Sidious was close enough to read, even through the perceptual blur of Revan's blended signature, was something Sidious hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time, possibly ever. Calculation. Not fear. Not rage. Not the desperate determination of someone who was losing and knew it. Calculation. The expression of a general who has just learned something useful and is deciding what to do with it. Sidious felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The specific chill of recognizing that the person across from you isn't responding to the fight you thought you were having. They are fighting a different fight, and you don't yet know what it is. What Revan had seen in those 10 seconds was the fault line. He'd watched Vitiate's consciousness surge through Sidious's force presence from the outside, visible to him in a way it wasn't visible to Sidious, because Revan's force perception wasn't dark side only. He could read the light of it and the dark of it and the junction between them. He'd spent 3 centuries inside something very similar. He recognized the pattern. An overwhelmingly powerful will pressing against a host's defenses from the inside. The only difference was that this time Revan wasn't the prisoner. This time he had access to both sides of the force simultaneously. He understood what needed to happen. It wasn't going to be a fight anymore. Not a fight Sidious could lose in any conventional sense. The consumed edge of Vitiate's energy had temporarily restored his combat effectiveness, and the coalition was already paying for the discharge that followed. Malgus was back on his feet, but moving more carefully. Satil Shan's anchor was cracked. Valen was burning too hot, and burning too hot was the specific vulnerability her life's conditioning had built in. She'd been made into a weapon that couldn't stop firing, which meant she'd eventually exhaust herself or break something that couldn't be fixed. What Revan needed wasn't victory in the engagement. What he needed was access to the fault line itself. He moved through the engagement zone towards Sidious, not fast, not with any particular combat intent registering in his force presence, the way someone moves towards something they've already decided to touch. Sidious raised his guard and prepared for a lightsaber exchange. What he got instead was a force connection. Revan reaching not at his body, but at the junction between Sidious's consciousness and Vitiate's, the seam that the surge had just temporarily sealed. Reaching into it not with the dark side's aggression, but with the light side's capacity for dissolution, and not with the light side's passivity, but with the dark side's absolute insistence on outcome, both at once. What happened inside Sidious in that moment was a resonance. Revan's blended force signature, pressed against the fault line, vibrated at a frequency that matched neither Sidious's unified dark side nor Vitiate's accumulated dark side, but sat between them. And between them, it destabilized both. Vitiate's consciousness, which had oriented toward Revan's arrival like a compass needle finding north, felt the full weight of Revan's presence and surged again, harder. This time, Sidious couldn't consume the leading edge, because Revan was holding the fault line open. For 11 seconds, Darth Sidious, the most powerful Sith who had ever existed by any reasonable measure, fought two battles simultaneously, and lost ground in both. He contained it. He was Sidious, but containing it cost him something he'd never spent before, a genuine expenditure of the force structure he'd built over decades, used not to attack or dominate, but simply to maintain the integrity of his own consciousness against an assault from two directions at once. The unified force presence he emerged from those 11 seconds with was smaller than the one he'd entered with. Not dramatically, measurably. Like a building that has had a floor removed, functionally standing, but not what it was. He stepped back, genuinely back, not the deliberate retreat of someone creating distance to recalibrate, but the involuntary step of someone who has just encountered something unexpected and needs a second to understand what it means. He stood there. The coalition stood opposite him. And something happened that had not happened in 50 years. The engagement paused. Not because of strategy, because both sides needed a moment. In that moment, the Eternal Fleet resolved. Arkan had been waiting for exactly this window, an engagement pause where the GEMINI hive mind's split loyalties couldn't be overridden by the immediacy of active combat. He spoke to the fleet with the authority his recognition code carried, and the droids, sentient, linked, designed for precision, made a calculation that was purely mathematical. Two legitimate authority signals, one slightly stronger than the other, not by much, but enough. 163 of the 300 ships swung their weapon arrays away from the coalition and held position. Not toward Sidious, just away, suspended, waiting. That was the final cost. Sidious stood with a fractured force presence, an internal fault line he had sealed but not healed. Half a fleet, and the knowledge that the thing he'd filed as anomalous had just demonstrated exactly why it couldn't be read, and what that meant in practical terms. He had absorbed something he thought was power, and discovered it was also a war. And the man who knew that war best was standing 30 feet away, looking at him with deliberate, patient calculation. He could win this. He was still, by almost any remaining measure, the stronger singular entity in this zone. His force lightning could still kill. His command of the dark side was still the most refined in history. The partial fleet was still an asset. But he wasn't what he had been 2 hours ago. And he wasn't going to admit, in the Force or anywhere else, how much those 11 seconds had cost him. He made a choice that surprised everyone present, possibly including himself. He withdrew. Not in defeat, not in surrender, in the specific way that a strategist withdraws when the tactical situation has yielded all the information it's going to yield, and further engagement produces diminishing returns against someone who can't be fully read. He pulled back through the engagement zone, drawing his remaining forces with him, and disappeared into hyperspace with the precision that only someone who has been planning his retreat since before the fight started demonstrates. Except he hadn't planned his retreat. He'd adapted to one. Palpatine knew the difference. He would be thinking about that distinction for a long time. In the hyperspace transit that followed, in the cold, non-space between destinations, Sidious sat with what he had not felt in 50 years. Not fear. He wouldn't call it fear. Fear was for beings who lacked the information to act, and Sidious now had more information than he'd had before the engagement. He knew what Revan was. He knew what the fault line was. He knew what the Eternal Fleet's recognition hierarchy could be exploited to do. He knew that absorbing Vitiate had given him something enormous, and given him a problem of equivalent scale. He knew, and this was the part that pressed against the edges of his certainty with a pressure he hadn't expected, that for 11 seconds he had not been in complete control of his own force presence. That had never happened. The entire architecture of his power, the unified dark side consciousness that had bent the galaxy to his will for 5 decades, had experienced for the first time a genuine fracture under genuine force. It had held. He had held it. And he would prepare now, with full information, for what was coming next. But in the silence of hyperspace, with the Vitiate current still running under his thoughts like a river that hadn't decided which way it was going, he allowed himself something he had no Sith vocabulary for, something he hadn't felt since long before he'd become Darth Sidious, since the years when he'd been Sheev Palpatine of Naboo, a young man learning what the dark side required. The possibility, not the certainty, not yet, that he wasn't, in fact, inevitable. It lasted 12 seconds. Then he began to plan. The coalition held its position in the aftermath. Malgus was already asking questions about what came next, because Malgus's version of the world didn't allow for conclusions that weren't followed by the next conflict. Sidious Shan was running through casualties and damage assessments with the systematic focus of someone who had survived too many battles to let relief distract from the accounting. Valen sat alone at the edge of the engagement zone and felt, possibly for the first time, what it was like to spend everything she had in a fight and still be standing at the end of it. Arcan stood with his brother. Neither of them spoke. Revan wasn't present for any of these conversations. He was at the edge of the formation, where the engagement zone met open space, and he was still. Not injured, exactly. The force connection he'd maintained against the junction of 2 vast, dark side consciousnesses had taken something from him that wasn't blood or bone. Something in the architecture of his blended force presence had been strained by the effort of holding Vitiate's recognition against Sidious's containment. He was still there, still himself, but the resonance in his force signature, the impossible blend of light and dark that had been his defining characteristic since 300 years of Vitiate's imprisonment, had forced his consciousness to occupy both sides simultaneously, was quieter than it had been before. Whether that was temporary wasn't yet clear. Sidious Shan found him there, and didn't immediately ask the question, because she had enough of her ancestor in her to understand when silence was something a person needed, rather than something they were suffering in. They stood together, the living Grand Master and the man who had been her ancestor's husband, who had died once and chosen to return, who had just done something that possibly couldn't be undone without cost, and watched the stars. After a while, she asked, "Can you still feel both sides?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "but they're closer together than they were." She didn't know if that was good or not. He looked like someone who wasn't sure either. One thing was certain. Sidious was gone. Not destroyed, not finished, but marked by something he hadn't been marked by before. Half a fleet, a fractured internal architecture, the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy was a Force user who could hold open the fault line that his greatest conquest had created. He would adapt. He would plan. He would be, when next they met, harder to reach and harder to fracture. And Revan was still here, still standing, still himself, or something close enough to himself that the difference might not matter yet. Only one side had retreated. It hadn't been the coalition. But that word, walked, was doing a great deal of work. Neither of them was what they had been this morning. That was the truth of it. That was the cost of it. And it was enough to understand, for now, that Part 1's euphoria is gone, replaced by something Sidious has never named before, and something Revan has spent centuries learning to carry. Subscribe for more stories like this.